Growing up as the youngest of 3 kids, I learned early that my opinion didn't matter much in the Williams household. While my older brothers Jake and Marcus were celebrated for their business degrees and real-world success, I was dismissed as the family oddball who worked some mysterious government job that nobody understood or cared to ask about. "What exactly do you do again?" Mom would ask at family dinners, not really listening to my vague answers about federal compliance and asset management. Dad would wave his hand dismissively. "Government bureaucracy. Paper pushing. At least it's stable, I guess." They had no idea I was a senior asset recovery specialist with the U.S. Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, specializing in complex money laundering investigations and asset forfeiture operations. For the past 8 years, I'd been tracking down hidden criminal assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars, working cases that involved international cartels, corporate fraud schemes, and offshore banking conspiracies. My family saw me as Sarah, the quiet 31-year-old who lived in a modest apartment and drove a practical Honda Civic. They didn't know about the federal security clearance, the encrypted communications, or the fact that I regularly testified before grand juries about financial crimes that made headlines. To them, I was just the family member who worked for the government, and apparently had nothing better to do with my time than listen to their problems. The dynamic became even more pronounced after Dad's construction company started struggling 3 years ago. Williams & Sons had been a decent mid-sized operation, but a series of bad contracts and cost overruns had left them hemorrhaging money. Dad refused to admit the business was failing, instead blaming the economy, unfair competition, and government regulations for his problems. If Sarah's government buddies would stop strangling small businesses with red tape, maybe honest companies could survive, he'd grumble during family gatherings, never catching the irony that his daughter worked in the very system he constantly criticized. Meanwhile, my brothers Jake and Marcus had leveraged their positions at the company into comfortable salaries despite contributing little actual value. Jake handled business development, which mostly meant playing golf with potential clients, while Marcus managed operations, which involved a lot of expensive business lunches and very little actual oversight of job sites. The family's financial stress created a perfect storm of resentment directed at me. Since I wasn't contributing to the family business and my government salary was just taxpayer money anyway, I became the convenient target for their frustrations. "Easy for Sarah to judge our business decisions when she's got that cushy government job," Marcus would say whenever I suggested maybe they should consider downsizing or restructuring. "Try working in the real world where you actually have to produce results." What they didn't know was that I'd been quietly watching their business practices for months, not as a daughter but as a federal investigator. Williams & Sons had started showing up in financial intelligence reports related to a major money laundering investigation I was working on. Shell companies with addresses matching their business locations. Cash transactions that didn't align with legitimate construction work. Subcontractors with interesting criminal histories. I'd recused myself from any direct involvement in the investigation to avoid conflicts of interest, but I couldn't ignore what I was seeing. My family's construction company was being used as a front for laundering drug money, and Dad was either incredibly naive or willfully ignorant about who was really paying for those lucrative contracts that had suddenly materialized to save his business. The trust fund became an issue 6 months ago when Dad discovered I had a substantial account that I never talked about. He'd accidentally seen bank statements while helping me move some boxes, and his eyes nearly popped out of his head when he saw the balance. $230,000? He'd gasped. "Sarah, where did this money come from?" I'd tried to deflect, explaining vaguely that it was related to my work. But Dad's desperation had already latched onto the number. His business needed exactly that kind of cash injection to survive, and in his mind family money should be used to save the family business. "This is perfect," he'd announced at the next family dinner. "Sarah can invest in Williams & Sons. It's a win-win situation." "Dad, it's not that simple," I tried to explain. "That money is tied up in federal protocols. I can't just withdraw it and invest in private businesses." But Dad heard what he wanted to hear. To him, my objections were just bureaucratic nonsense that could be worked around. After all, it was my money, wasn't it? How hard could it be to access my own trust fund? The pressure campaign started immediately. Mom began talking about family loyalty and how we all needed to stick together during tough times. Jake suggested that successful families invested in each other's ventures. Marcus pointed out that I was being selfish by hoarding money while the family business collapsed. You're sitting on a fortune while your father's life work crumbles, Mom had said during one particularly intense conversation. What kind of daughter does that? I tried repeatedly to explain that the account wasn't actually my personal money, that it was held in trust for federal purposes, that there were legal restrictions on how it could be used. But my family had never understood the complexities of my work, and they weren't about to start now. Government excuses, Dad would mutter. There's always some regulation or procedure that prevents people from doing the right thing. The situation escalated 3 weeks ago when Dad announced he'd found a solution. He'd been researching trust fund regulations and discovered that there were ways to access money in emergency situations, especially when it involved family business investments. I've been talking to lawyers, he declared proudly at Sunday dinner. There are hardship provisions that allow trust fund withdrawals for legitimate business purposes. All you need to do is file the right paperwork. Dad, it doesn't work that way, I tried to explain once again. This isn't a normal trust fund. There are federal restrictions. Every trust fund has restrictions, Jake had interrupted. That's why you hire professionals to handle the paperwork. Dad's already found lawyers who specialize in this stuff. The lawyers Dad had found were exactly the kind of people I'd expect him to find. Smooth-talking operators who promised they could unlock any trust fund for the right fee. They'd filled his head with stories about legal loopholes and emergency provisions, taking his consultation fees while feeding his desperation. These guys know what they're doing, Dad had insisted. They've handled hundreds of cases like this. Trust fund money sitting idle while families suffer financial hardship. It's exactly what these emergency provisions were designed for. I'd tried one more time to explain the reality of the situation. Dad, that account is managed by the federal government. It's not a private trust fund. I don't have the authority to withdraw money from it, and even if I did, using it for private business investments would be a serious federal crime. But Dad had already made up his mind. In his view, I was either being deliberately obstructive or I'd been brainwashed by government bureaucracy into believing their regulatory nonsense. Either way, he was going to save his business and his family, even if it meant going around me to do it. The breaking point came last Tuesday during our regular family dinner at Mom and Dad's house. Dad had been unusually quiet during the meal, and I'd sensed something was building. When Mom served dessert, he'd cleared his throat and made his announcement. I have some good news, he'd begun, his chest puffed out with pride. I've solved our business problems. Williams & Sons is going to survive and thrive. Jake and Marcus had leaned forward eagerly, sensing that Dad had finally found the miracle solution they'd been hoping for. Mom had smiled encouragingly, ready to celebrate whatever victory Dad was about to announce. I took your trust money for the company, Dad had declared, looking directly at me. Finally putting it to good use. The words hit me like a physical blow. For a moment I couldn't process what he'd just said. Then the implications began cascading through my mind, each one more catastrophic than the last. What exactly do you mean? I'd asked carefully, my voice barely above a whisper. The lawyers figured out how to access your account, Dad had continued, oblivious to my growing horror. Emergency business investment provisions. We filed the paperwork last week and the money was transferred yesterday. $230,000, just like we needed. Mom had started applauding, her face beaming with pride. Your father saved the business, Sarah. Isn't that wonderful? Jake had reached across the table to slap Dad on the back. Brilliant move, Dad. I knew you'd figure out a way to make this work. The lawyers earned every penny of their fee, Marcus had added. Sometimes you need professionals who understand how to work within the system. I'd sat there in stunned silence, watching my family celebrate what they thought was a clever financial maneuver. They had no idea they'd just committed multiple federal felonies. Unauthorized access to a federal asset seizure account. Identity theft. Wire fraud. Money laundering. The charges would be enough to put Dad in federal prison for decades. How exactly did you access the account? I'd managed to ask. The lawyers handled all the technical stuff, Dad had waved dismissively. Something about emergency trustee provisions and hardship exemptions. They had to use your social security number and some other personal information, but that's normal for trust fund transfers. Identity theft. Wire fraud. Bank fraud. The list kept growing. Where did you get my personal information? I'd pressed. From your tax documents, Mom had said helpfully. You left some paperwork here last month when you were helping us organize the basement. We made copies for the lawyers. Federal tax document theft. More wire fraud. The criminal exposure was expanding by the minute. Dad, I'd said as calmly as I could manage, that account wasn't actually a trust fund. It's a federal asset seizure account used in criminal investigations. The room had gone quiet for a moment before Dad had burst out laughing. Nice try, Sarah, he chuckled. The lawyers already explained how people try to scare family members away from accessing trust funds by making up stories about government restrictions. It's a common tactic to maintain control over family money. I'm not making anything up, I'd said. That money was seized from criminal organizations as part of federal investigations. It's held in trust by the Treasury Department until the cases are resolved. Government propaganda, Jake had scoffed. They want people to believe their money isn't really their money. Classic bureaucratic intimidation. Sarah, honey, Mom had said in a condescending tone, your father researched this thoroughly. The lawyers confirmed that trust fund money belongs to the beneficiary, regardless of what government agencies might claim. You can't let them bully you into believing otherwise. I'd realized then that nothing I said was going to penetrate their certainty. They'd made up their minds that this was just another example of government overreach, and my attempts to explain the reality would only reinforce their belief that I'd been brainwashed by federal bureaucracy. The important thing, Dad had concluded, is that Williams & Sons is saved. We can pay off our debts, secure new contracts, and get back to building this family business. Your trust fund money is going to create jobs and strengthen our community. Dad, I'd said one final time, you need to return that money immediately. Contact the lawyers and reverse the transfer before. Before what? Marcus had interrupted. Before the government realizes they can't intimidate us into giving up family money? Sarah, you need to stop being so paranoid about federal regulations. Dad's lawyers know what they're doing. I'd nodded slowly, my mind already shifting into federal investigator mode. Understood. The word had come out automatically, the standard response I used when witnesses or suspects said something that would later be used against them in court. My family had interpreted it as acceptance, but they had no idea what it actually meant. After dinner, I'd excused myself early and driven straight home. The first call I'd made was to my supervisor at FinCEN, reporting that a federal asset seizure account under my oversight had been compromised through identity theft and fraudulent access. The second call had been to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, providing them with the details of the unauthorized transfer and the identity of the perpetrators. The third call had been the hardest one. I'd contacted the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, knowing that they would need to initiate a full audit of Dad's business finances to determine the scope of the money laundering operation that had been funding Williams & Sons for the past year. By midnight, I'd filed formal complaints for identity theft, wire fraud, bank fraud, money laundering, and unauthorized access to federal assets. Each complaint included detailed documentation of Dad's statements, the lawyers he'd used, and the methods they'd employed to steal federal funds. The next morning, Dad had been in his office at Williams & Sons when his phone started ringing. The first call had been from his bank, asking about unusual activity on his business accounts. The second call had been from the lawyers who'd helped him access the trust fund, explaining that there might be some complications with the transfer. The third call had been from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. Mr. Williams, Agent Jennifer Martinez had said when Dad answered, "This is the IRS Criminal Division. We need to speak with you immediately regarding unauthorized access to federal assets and potential money laundering activities involving your business." Dad had tried to explain that everything was legal, that lawyers had handled all the paperwork, that he was just accessing his daughter's trust fund to save a legitimate family business. Agent Martinez had listened patiently before explaining that the account in question was not a private trust fund but a federal asset seizure account protected under multiple criminal statutes. "Sir," she'd said, "you've committed several federal felonies. We need you to come in for questioning immediately." The phone call to me had come 20 minutes later. "Sarah," Dad's voice had been shaky and confused, "there are some people here from the IRS who seem to think I've done something wrong. They're saying that your trust fund is actually some kind of government account." "Yes, Dad," I'd said quietly. "I tried to explain that to you. But the lawyer said, The lawyers lied to you, Dad. They took your consultation fees and helped you commit federal crimes. The money you accessed wasn't mine. It was seized from drug dealers and money launderers as part of criminal investigations. There had been a long silence on the other end of the line. Sarah, Dad had whispered, what's going to happen to me? You need to get a real lawyer, Dad. A criminal defense attorney who specializes in federal cases. And you need to return the money immediately. Can you help me? Can you explain to your people that this was just a misunderstanding? I'd closed my eyes, feeling the weight of 8 years of federal law enforcement training. Dad, I can't help you. I'm the federal agent who reported the crimes. Another long silence. You're the one who called the IRS on me? I had no choice, Dad. You stole money from federal asset seizure accounts. That's not a family dispute. That's a federal crime. The call had ended without another word. Over the next 3 days, the full scope of Dad's legal problems had become clear. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division had frozen all of Williams & Sons' bank accounts pending a complete audit. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit had opened an investigation into the money laundering operation that had been using Dad's construction company as a front. The U.S. Attorney's Office had begun preparing federal indictments for wire fraud, bank fraud, identity theft, and money laundering. The lawyers who'd helped Dad access the federal account had disappeared, their office suddenly closed and their phone numbers disconnected. Dad had realized too late that he'd been the victim of a sophisticated scam designed to target desperate business owners and convince them to commit federal crimes. But the worst revelation had come when federal investigators began tracing the money that had been funding Williams & Sons for the past year. The lucrative contracts that had kept the business afloat weren't legitimate construction work. They were payments from a drug trafficking organization that had been using Dad's company to launder millions of dollars in narcotics proceeds. Your father may have been an unwitting participant, Agent Martinez had explained to me during a briefing, but ignorance isn't a defense when it comes to money laundering. He accepted cash payments, failed to verify the legitimacy of his clients, and didn't report suspicious activity to federal authorities. The family meeting had been scheduled for Friday afternoon at Mom and Dad's house. I'd arrived to find Jake, Marcus, and their wives sitting around the living room looking shell-shocked. Mom had been crying quietly in the kitchen while Dad sat in his recliner staring at a stack of legal documents. The lawyers want a $100,000 retainer, Dad had said without looking up when I walked in. Real lawyers this time. Criminal defense attorneys. The business accounts are frozen, Jake had added. We can't make payroll. We can't pay suppliers. Williams & Sons is finished. 30-year family business, Marcus had said bitterly. Gone because Sarah decided to destroy her own father. I'd taken a seat across from Dad, maintaining the same calm composure I used during federal interrogations. I didn't destroy anything, Marcus. Dad committed federal crimes. I reported those crimes because that's my job and my legal obligation. Your job. Mom had emerged from the kitchen, her eyes red from crying. Your job is to protect your family, not destroy it. My job is to investigate financial crimes and recover stolen assets. When Dad accessed that federal account, he became a federal criminal. My personal relationship with him doesn't change that fact. You could have warned us, Jake had accused. You could have explained the situation before Dad got in this deep. I tried to warn you. Multiple times. You all decided I was just making excuses to avoid helping the family business. Because you never explained it clearly. Marcus had shouted. You talked about federal protocols and restrictions, but you never said it was criminal money. I'd looked around the room at their angry, desperate faces. I told you repeatedly that the account was managed by the federal government and that accessing it would be a federal crime. What part of that wasn't clear? The part where you're a federal agent, Dad had said quietly. You never told us you work in law enforcement. I told you I work in federal compliance and asset management. I couldn't give you details about my security clearance or my specific cases, but I tried to warn you about the legal consequences. Compliance and asset management sounds like accounting, Mom had protested. Not criminal investigation. Because I can't discuss classified federal operations with my family. But I can tell you when you're about to commit federal crimes, which I did. Repeatedly. The room had fallen silent except for Mom's quiet sobbing. So what happens now? Dad had finally asked. Now you face federal prosecution. The U.S. Attorney's Office is preparing indictments for wire fraud, bank fraud, identity theft, and money laundering. You're looking at 20 to 30 years in federal prison. What about the money? Jake had asked. Can we return it and make this go away? The money was returned to federal custody yesterday. But returning stolen federal assets doesn't erase the crimes that were committed to steal them. This is insane, Marcus had burst out. Sarah works for the government. She should be able to fix this. I can't fix federal crimes, Marcus. I can only investigate them and report them, which is what I did. You chose your job over your family, Mom had accused through her tears. I chose federal law over federal crimes. The fact that my family committed those crimes doesn't change my obligation to report them. Dad had looked up at me then, his face aged 10 years in the past week. Do you have any idea what you've done to this family? Do you have any idea what you did when you decided to steal money from federal asset seizure accounts? When you allowed drug dealers to launder money through your business? When you refused to listen to my warnings about federal crimes? We didn't know. You didn't want to know. Every time I tried to explain the legal risks, you dismissed it as government bureaucracy. You made up your minds that I was the problem, not the federal crimes you were planning to commit. The final blow had come when Agent Martinez arrived with the formal indictment paperwork. Dad was being charged with 14 federal felonies related to money laundering, wire fraud, bank fraud, and identity theft. Williams & Sons was being seized as a criminal enterprise used to facilitate money laundering operations. Mr. Williams, Agent Martinez had said as she placed Dad under arrest, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in federal court. As Dad was led away in handcuffs, Mom had turned to me with pure hatred in her eyes. I hope you're proud of yourself, she'd spat. You've destroyed your family to protect drug money. I've protected federal assets that will be used to compensate the victims of drug trafficking. Dad destroyed this family when he decided to commit federal crimes rather than listen to his daughter's warnings. Jake and Marcus had refused to look at me as they followed the police cars to the federal courthouse. Their wives had glared at me like I was personally responsible for ruining their comfortable lives built on laundered drug money. That evening I'd sat in my apartment reviewing the case files and federal statutes that would determine Dad's fate. 23 years minimum for the money laundering charges. 10 years for the wire fraud. 5 years for the bank fraud. 3 years for the identity theft. The sentences would likely run concurrently, but Dad was looking at spending the rest of his life in federal prison. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 8 years I'd been tracking down criminals who thought they could outsmart federal law enforcement. I'd recovered hundreds of millions in stolen assets, dismantled money laundering operations, and sent dozens of financial criminals to federal prison. I'd never imagined that my own family would become another case file in my federal investigation portfolio. The phone call from Mom had come 3 days later. The lawyers say there might be a plea agreement, she'd said without preamble. If your father cooperates with the investigation and provides information about the money laundering operation. That's between Dad and the U.S. Attorney's Office, I'd replied. I can't influence federal prosecution decisions. Can't or won't. Both. Federal agents don't negotiate with criminals, even when those criminals are family members. He's your father, Sarah. He's a federal criminal who stole money from asset seizure accounts and allowed drug dealers to launder millions through his business. Being my father doesn't change those facts. Mom had hung up without another word. The plea negotiation had taken 2 weeks. Dad's criminal defense attorney had argued that he'd been the victim of a sophisticated scam, manipulated by fake lawyers into believing he was accessing legitimate trust fund money. The U.S. Attorney's Office had agreed to consider a reduced sentence in exchange for Dad's cooperation in the broader money laundering investigation. In the end, Dad had pled guilty to money laundering and wire fraud in exchange for a 12-year federal prison sentence. He'd provided testimony about the cash payments, the suspicious clients, and the fake lawyers who'd convinced him to steal federal assets. Williams & Sons had been permanently shut down and its assets liquidated to pay restitution. Jake and Marcus had lost their jobs and faced potential criminal charges for their roles in the money laundering operation. Mom had been forced to sell the family house to pay for Dad's legal defense. The final family meeting had been held in the federal courthouse lobby after Dad's sentencing hearing. 12 years, Mom had said numbly. Your father will be 78 years old when he gets out of prison. If he lives that long, Jake had added bitterly. You did this, Marcus had accused me one final time. You destroyed our family. Dad did this when he chose to commit federal crimes rather than listen to my warnings. I'm sorry it ended this way, but I couldn't ignore federal law violations just because they involved my family. You could have found another way, Mom had insisted. You could have helped us work within the system. I tried to help you work within the system. I explained repeatedly that the account was protected by federal law and that accessing it would be criminal. You chose not to believe me. Because we trusted your father's lawyers. You trusted criminals who were scamming desperate business owners into committing federal crimes. I warned you they were lying, but you dismissed my warnings as government bureaucracy. The courthouse lobby had echoed with the sound of Mom's crying and the footsteps of federal marshals escorting other convicted criminals to their sentencing hearings. What happens to our family now? Jake had asked. That's up to you. Dad will serve his sentence. You and Marcus will face whatever charges the U.S. attorney decides to file. Mom will rebuild her life without the money that came from drug trafficking. And you? Marcus had sneered. You go back to your government job, proud of destroying your own family? I go back to investigating financial crimes and protecting federal assets. Just like I was doing before Dad decided to steal from asset seizure accounts. You chose your job over your family, Mom had repeated her earlier accusation. I chose federal law over federal crimes. The same choice I make every day in my work. The fact that this case involved my family doesn't change my obligation to uphold federal law. As I'd watched my family walk away from the courthouse, I'd realized that they still didn't understand what had really happened. In their minds, I'd betrayed them by choosing my government job over family loyalty. They couldn't accept that Dad had committed serious federal crimes, or that my role as a federal agent required me to report those crimes regardless of my personal relationships. 3 months later, I'd received a letter from Dad in federal prison. He'd finally begun to understand the reality of what he'd done, and the consequences his choices had created for everyone around him. Sarah, he'd written, I know now that you were trying to protect me. I should have listened when you warned me about federal crimes. I should have trusted your expertise instead of trusting criminals who were using me to steal government money. I'm sorry for what I put our family through, and I'm sorry for blaming you for the consequences of my own decisions. I'd kept the letter, along with the case files that documented the investigation of United States versus Williams. It served as a reminder that federal law doesn't make exceptions for family relationships, and that even the people we love most can become criminals when they choose to ignore warnings about federal crimes. The Williams family construction business was gone forever, destroyed by Dad's decision to trust criminals instead of his daughter's warnings about federal law. But the federal assets Dad had tried to steal were returned to their proper accounts, where they would eventually be used to compensate the victims of the drug trafficking organization that had been laundering money through Williams and Sons. In the end, federal justice had been served, just as it always is when people choose to commit crimes against the United States government. The fact that this particular criminal was my father didn't change the outcome, only made it more personally painful to watch. But that's the nature of federal law enforcement work. Sometimes the criminals you investigate turn out to be the people you love most. And when that happens, you have to choose between family loyalty and federal law. I chose federal law, just as I'd sworn to do when I took my oath as a federal agent. And I'd make the same choice again.